right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar, Lafayette and the Farewell Tour, Odyssey of an American Idol. My name is Brittany Garrett. I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village, and tonight we are going to learn about the firsthand account of Lafayette's Farewell Tour of America in 1824 and how the 200th anniversary is being celebrated. And to lead us through this presentation, we are joined by Alan Hoffman, Esquire. Alan obtained his BA in history from Yale, where he studied under Professor Edmund Morgan before earning a JD at Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Boston for 50 years. An avid reader of early American history, he discovered Lafayette in 2002 and spent 2 years translating Auguste Lafasseux's Lafayette in America in 1824 and 1825, which is the first-hand account of Lafayette's Farewell Tour of America. This translation was published in 2006 and is in its third printing. Hoffman has lectured widely on Lafayette and has spoken in each of the 24 states which Lafayette visited during the Farewell Tour. Hoffman is an officer of 2 Lafayette societies. He currently serves as president of the American Friends of Lafayette and president of the Massachusetts Lafayette Society. He is also the editor of the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Alan. And at the close of our presentation, we are also joined by Peter Riley, who sits on the planning committees for both the national and Massachusetts events connected to the bicentennial of Lafayette's Farewell Tour. And he will speak about the commemorative events that are taking place over the next year and how everyone can get involved. Welcome, Peter.
Hello.
So before we begin, I would like to share a land acknowledgement. Old Sturbridge Village is located on the traditional land of the Nipmuc peoples. New England and the rest of the United States consists of land expropriated from Native American peoples. We honor the land and the indigenous peoples who have stored it throughout the generations and continue to store it today. Thank you. So just a couple of reminders before we begin. This program is being recorded and it will be posted on our Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page, which I encourage you all to visit. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of our discussion tonight, so I invite all of our live viewers to submit any questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature at the bottom center of your screen. And now, without any further ado, I will pass things on to Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany. What I propose to do tonight is to give you an overview of the farewell tour and also address its significance for today. And I will start in 1846. Brittany, you can put on the first slide. In 1846, Ensigns and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside, which you see in front of you, called Pictorial History of the United States. In addition to depicting the seals of each of the states and printed information about the discovery of the Americas, the battles of the Revolution, the War of 1812, population statistics for 1790, 1840, and a list of distinguished men, this print contains 3 images, the images of 3 figures below the title, Pictorial History of the United States. Washington, as you can see, is in the middle. Franklin is to his left, and on his good right hand, General Lafayette. Not Jefferson or Madison or Adams or Hamilton or even Jackson, who was still very popular at the time, but a Frenchman, Lafayette. Why was that? I'm here to try to explain it. In the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before his arrival in 1824. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the American Revolution, his subsequent activities on behalf of America, his adopted land, his close friendship with George Washington, and his storybook life. However, this trip, during which he toured each of the then 24 states and was treated as a conquering hero, reaffirmed his reputation and elevated him into iconic status. The only analogies I can think of from my experience is the excitement caused among teenagers by the Beatles in their 1960s tours, or the 1979 visit of John Paul II. The result of the farewell tour was that Lafayette's name was firmly imprinted on the American psyche. When state banks printed legal tender, Lafayette's face appeared on bills in more states than anyone except Washington. Scores of counties, cities, towns, and townships. Actually, I once spent a rainy Sunday afternoon counting them in the Rand McNally Atlas that I had. There were about 80 of them, were named for Lafayette, either Lafayette, Fayette, Fayetteville, Lafayetteville, or LaGrange, the name of the chateau that he lived in from 1779 to 1834. The next slide is an image of the Chateau Lagrange, as they say in French. There is even one Lagrangeville. In America, they call it LaGrange. There are countless streets, squares, and parks named for Lafayette. There are 8 streets named for Lafayette in the city of Boston alone, and 12 in the 5 boroughs of New York. Worcester has a Lafayette Street and a LaGrange Street. Numerous statues and monuments were built to honor Lafayette. My favorite is Daniel Chester French's Lafayette Monument, which stands proudly in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, where I grew up. The next slide is an image of the Lafayette Monument in Brooklyn. An equestrian statue by Paul Wayland Bartlett was given to France in 1908. It was called the Children's Statue because the fundraising was done by thousands, tens of thousands of American school children. It stood outside the Louvre until the I.M. Pei Pyramid was constructed, which event caused its removal to a much more obscure spot, I might add, on the right bank of the Seine. The next slide is the children's statue, pretty impressive statue. A copy of this statue sits near the State House in Hartford, Connecticut. I'll show you one more Lafayette statue. This one is Lafayette clasping the hand of Washington. It's by Bartholdi, the sculptor of the Statue of Liberty. It sits in Lafayette Square at the southern tip of Morningside Heights in New York City. Mount Lafayette was named by the good people of Franconia, New Hampshire in 1834. Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania was named in 1824, was named in 1826. There is a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and a Lafayette River in southern Virginia. Now, Lafayette decided to return to the United States one last time after he received President Monroe's invitation in early 1824. In July of that year, he departed for America with his son, who was named for George Washington, his paternal friend, George Washington Lafayette, with Auguste Levasseur, his private secretary, who kept a journal of the trip, and a valet aboard the Cadmus, an American packet ship. We'll see an image of that in a few minutes. This trip, the farewell tour, was a unique event in our history, if not the history of the world. You may think that what I just said is hyperbole. However, I'm not the first person to express this opinion. In 1830, Edward Everett wrote a review of the book that I translated, Lafayette en Amérique, in 1824 at 1825, Lafayette's secretary's firsthand account of the farewell tour. In it, he praised the book, Lafayette and the Farewell Tour. About the tour, he wrote, an event taken in all its parts, unparalleled in the history of man. Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and a cane and wears a hairpiece. I have nothing against hairpieces, but many people didn't realize that he was wearing a hairpiece, who has wielded no military power or governmental authority since 1792, when he served as a general in defense of France, who then held no public position in either France or, of course, in the United States, and he's treated like a Caesar or an Alexander for 13 months in every corner of this vast country. There are parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children, the public, and members of private societies. There are dedications of public monuments and buildings, and a plethora of speeches and toasts. Triumphal arches are constructed welcoming Lafayette in cities, large cities, and small towns. Americans of all races, each gender, and of every age wanted to touch this man who had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created. There are Lafayette prints, fans, hats, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, ribbons. I'll show you now a Lafayette ribbon that was worn by the school children in Boston. Brittany, will you put on the next slide, please? There's that beautiful ribbon. There are Lafayette scarves. The next slide is a Lafayette scarf made in Philadelphia in 1824. As you can see, it has patriotic symbols and says, "Welcome, Lafayette." There was staffature and other ceramics, including a set of dishes depicting Lafayette's arrival in New York City. And there were ladies' kid gloves with his face printed on them. The next slide are two examples of Lafayette gloves. Actually, there were men's kid gloves as well. The next slide I will show you is a Welcome Lafayette drum, which is in the collection of Old Sturbridge Village. It's a beautifully preserved piece from the farewell tour. Numerous American painters wanted to, and many did, paint him from life. The two perhaps most famous of the paintings are Samuel Morse's painting of Lafayette. Today it stands in the New York City Hall. It was commissioned by the city of New York. He later, of course, invented the telegraph, but he was a fine painter, and it shows Lafayette in front of the bus of Washington and Franklin, and an empty pedestal waiting for his bus. And the next slide is the Philadelphia equivalent by Thomas Sully of Philadelphia. On August 15th, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. The next slide is the only image that I know of this ship, the Cadmus of New York. As Levasseur, the author of the journal, contemplated Staten Island to his left, he writes, "The noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette, which was announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York." The next slide is a 19th century painting. That structure in the water that you see, made of stones, is Fort Lafayette. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in about 1960 to make way for the Verrazano Bridge. It stood where one of the stanchions on the eastern side of the bridge, the Brooklyn side of the bridge, now stands. Because it was a Sunday, Lafayette disembarked in Staten Island and stayed at the home of then Vice President Daniel Tompkins. On the following day, he arrived, which was a Monday, and the city was now ready for him. He arrived at the Battery at Castle Garden in the southern tip of Manhattan on a steamship called the Chancellor Livingston, which had won the honor to bring him to Manhattan. They were accompanied by a numerous flotilla of boats and were welcomed by all the military and civilian dignitaries of the city of New York, and according to Levasseur, a crowd of 200,000. The next slide, and by the way, that's probably a high estimate. I've seen 100 and I've seen 50. But the next slide is one of the ceramics I talked about. It shows the arrival of Lafayette at Castle Garden. And the next slide is what Castle Garden looks like today. It used to be out actually in the water. There was like a causeway. but there's been so much filling of Battery Park that now it's on land. Having been feted in New York City, Lafayette headed for Boston on August 20, 1824, on the Old Post Road. He arrived at the Shirley Eustace House, which was then the governor's mansion in Roxbury, a near suburb, a little after midnight on the 24th. On the morning of the 24th, he headed for Boston from the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury in a procession of 70,000, according to the newspaper accounts. Lafayette crossed the Boston Common to the State House, where he was addressed by the governor, who had been his host the night before, and replied. He was escorted to apartments that the city alderman had prepared for him, sparing no expense. I'm going to talk a little bit about these apartments and the background because it shows to what extent the cities and even small towns went to welcome Lafayette and to make him comfortable. The backstory to the apartments where Lafayette stayed from August 24th until his departure from Boston on September 2nd is beautifully told in an exhibition catalog called Rather Elegant Than Showy, the Classical Furniture of Isaac Vose. There was an exhibit at the Massachusetts Historical Society of Vose furniture. To summarize, the alderman rented a portion of the Amory House at 22 Beacon Street and gorgeously furnished it. That building still exists. It's a beautiful building. It's right at the corner of Park and Beacon Street across from the State House. As the authors write, the city of Boston hired only the most respected craftsmen for the furnishings, Vose & Sons for furniture and lighting, and Hedges for upholstery, draperies, and carpeting. Consistent with this high standard, they also selected the city's leading gilder and looking glass maker, John Doggett. He billed the city for a loan of 2 pairs of looking glasses, one pair valued at an extraordinary $425. The Vose furniture consisted of 78 items that the city purchased, including this beautiful rosewood couch, which was the highlight of the exhibition at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Mr. Doggett, the gilder, also provided 5 Gilbert Stuart paintings, one of each president for Lafayette, so that he would be with his friends while he remained in Boston. Moreover, the city hired a barouche with 4 white horses. A barouche is an open carriage for Lafayette's use. In the afternoon of the 24th, there was a dinner at the Exchange Tavern in downtown Boston. According to the local press, Lafayette visited John Hancock's widow at her home in the evening. This visit is memorialized in Louisa May Alcott's book, which was published in about 1869, called An Old-Fashioned Girl. While this is a work of fiction, the story has the ring of truth to it, and its veracity is supported by the familial relationship between Alcott's mother, Abby May Alcott, and Madam Hancock. They were both related to Josiah Quincy, who was then the mayor of Boston. Alcott's mother would have been about 70 years old at the time that this book was written. In this story, a grandmother describes Lafayette's visit to her grandchildren and their friends. Well, by and by, Louisa May Alcott writes, the general, escorted by the mayor, that's Mayor Quincy, drove up. Dear me, I see him now, the little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and ruffled shirt, leaning on his cane, for he was lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman. As he approached, the three ladies arose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette bowed first to the governor's picture, then to the governor's widow, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old man kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheek. Yes, my dears, here is just the spot where the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man and helped us in our trouble. The next slide is another Lafayette glove. This one came down in the family of Mayor Quincy, his daughter, Eliza Susan Quincy. It was likely the type of glove that was worn by Madam Hancock at the time of Lafayette's visit. While in Boston, Lafayette visited Harvard College twice, first for graduation ceremonies and then for a Phi Beta Kappa dinner where Edward Everett gave the address. On the 29th, he visited John Adams in Quincy. On the 31st, he headed north, stopping in Chelsea, Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, and Newburyport, all on one day. There were events in each of those places, and it rained while all this was going on. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1 in Portsmouth. Although Lafayette proved to be a magnet for all Americans, veterans, particularly veterans of the American Revolution, hastened to greet him. September 1 happened to be the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College. As Peter Wallner writes in his biography of New Hampshire's only president, Franklin had been selected to give an honorary oration in Latin and wrote his father, General Benjamin Pierce, who was a veteran of Bunker Hill and, of course, the American Revolution, hoping he would attend the ceremony. Wallner writes, in this he was disappointed, however, as the old general joined other Revolutionary War soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on his famous tour of the United States. So General Pierce dissed his son's college graduation and valedictory address to spend some time with Lafayette. After having visited Portsmouth and returned to Boston, Lafayette headed west to Lexington, Concord, and Worcester on his return to New York City for his second visit there. In Lexington, a banner was hung on an evergreen at the entrance to Lexington Green. The next slide is that banner. You can't tell, welcome friend of America to the birthplace of American liberty. You can't tell from this photograph, but it's 39 feet long, 9 inches tall, green paint on cloth. It's an amazing artifact. It's actually on exhibit as we speak. There's an exhibit at Monroe Tavern in Lexington of Lafayette's and Washington's visits to Lexington. However, you can only see about 4 or 5 feet of it. I think they just have the word liberty available for inspection. After Lafayette's departure, the Boston aldermen conducted an auction to recoup their investment in the furniture that they had provided for Lafayette's comfort. Lafayette left New York again in late September 1824 and headed west through New Jersey to Philadelphia before heading southward. Lafayette arrived at Yorktown in time to celebrate Surrender Day on October 19th. He reached Monticello on November 4th and spent 10 days with Jefferson before spending a few days with Madison at Montpelier. While he was with Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson took him to the University of Virginia, and there was an event held in the Rotunda. During this event, Jefferson had a speech read for him, which talked about the services that Lafayette had provided to America after the Revolution in the 1780s, while Jefferson was our minister to France. These services included opening up numerous ports to American trade on favorable terms, including whale oil, and really saving the whale oil industry in Nantucket by brokering a contract between the city of Paris and Nantucket whalers to supply oil for all the street lamps of of Paris. In his speech, Jefferson said of Lafayette with respect to these accomplishments, "I only held the nail, he drove it." In 1786, the people of Nantucket expressed their gratitude by dedicating one day's milk from every cow on the island to produce a 500-pound cheese, which they sent to Lafayette in France. That's like one of the audience in one of my lectures told me that's like sending coals to Newcastle. Lafayette spent much of the winter of 1824 in Washington City, making a number of side trips to Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Although his original intent was to visit only the first 13 states, he decided at this point to accept invitations from all the other states. This also facilitated his return to Boston in 1825 for the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. When he was in Charlestown in 1824, they invited him to attend, and he said, "If I still was in the country, I will attend." Thus, Lafayette left Washington City for his southern and western campaigns in late February 1825. After stopping in places in Virginia and North Carolina, he entered South Carolina. In Columbia, the capital, an incident occurred which encapsulates this man who made no distinctions of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, local officials had decreed that slaves, as well as freed black men, should be kept away from all the public ceremonies and parades in honor of Lafayette. They did this, including the authorities in Columbia, because of Lafayette's well-known reputation as an anti-slavery advocate. In an autobiographical sketch of Dr. Maurice Moore, who was a militiaman when Lafayette visited Columbia on March 11, 1825, the following incident is described. It occurred at a private reception after a parade and a militia review. Two sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted at the door to prevent the entrance of intruders. Officers, however, were allowed to enter unquestioned. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in, but the sentinels interposed their guns to his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, "Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born. Been where they've been shot by soldiers too." And without further opposition from anyone, gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, "I come to see General Lafayette." "An old acquaintance, don't tell me who it is," the general said. The Negro advanced to the Marquis and, bowing, held out his hand and said, "Howdy, Master Lafayette. How you do, sir? You remember me?" "Yes, stop. Don't tell me your name." "Ah, I have it. Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed at Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me," said he, as he shook warmly the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity. Then he put out his hand and said, "Goodbye, Master Lafayette. We getting old. We'll never meet again. God bless you." They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. Lafayette, unlike most Americans at the time, and in particular in the South, was not infected by what William Cooper Nell, a African American abolitionist, wrote in his book, The Black Patriots of the American Revolution. He was not infected by color phobia. He went out of his way during the farewell tour to make contact with African Americans. For example, in New York, he specifically asked to visit the African Free School in New Orleans. He specifically asked the governor to introduce him to the regiment of free blacks who had fought in the War of 1812. By the way, those Southern municipal officials were not wrong to be concerned about Lafayette's influence. Lewis Hayden, who later escaped to Boston and became a leading abolitionist, his and his wife Harriet's house is on the African American Freedom Trail in Boston, was an enslaved boy in Lexington, Kentucky, when Lafayette arrived in May of 1825. Hayden, in a memoir dated, said he first became aware of his hatred, his passionate hatred of the institution of slavery as a result of an incident when Lafayette visited Lexington. He describes it this way: Lafayette was in full march under the town militia escort. I went a mile to meet them and found the fences lined with people. Lafayette was in a barouche drawn by 4 horses, and as he passed the people, he bowed to them on both sides. When he passed me, he bowed to the fence I was on. I looked around and saw no one else on the fence. And what did I do but roll right down on the ground, frightened almost to death? As I did so, it was come foot, help body, for I never stopped running until I got under the guns that were to fire the salute. Lafayette was the most famous man I had ever heard of, and you can imagine how I felt, a slave boy, to be favored with his recognition. That act burnt his image upon my heart, so that I never shall need a permit to recall it. I date my hatred of slavery from that day, and I tell you that after that, I allowed no moving thing on the face of the earth to stand between me and my freedom. After Lafayette's Southern and Western tours, he returned to Boston for the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. In Daniel Webster's Bunker Hill Ovation, before, according to a Louis Orr, 45,000 people. Actually, he was low on this one. There are estimates that range from 100 to 200,000. He addressed Lafayette, who was seated in an armchair in front of the surviving veterans of the American Revolution. He said, "Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the New World to the Old," referring to the French Revolution. Lafayette then made a second trip to New Hampshire, this time to the capital city of Concord. And in order to accomplish his goal of visiting all 24 states, he headed east to Maine on June 23rd, 1825, and returning to Concord on the 27th, and heading west then towards Vermont. After spending the night in Claremont, New Hampshire, he departed on the 28th of June in a ceremonial wagon belonging to Dr. Leonard Jarvis. The next slide is that wagon. It's in the collection of the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook, New York. He traveled to Cornish, where the Vermont authorities were waiting for him, and they carried their precious cargo across the bridge to Vermont, the 24th state that Lafayette visited. After Vermont, Lafayette traveled back to New York City for the July 4th celebrations. As he left New York on July 14th, a militia unit, an artillery unit that had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette's service in the Parisian National Guard during the French Revolution, saw him off. Now, the next slide is a painting commissioned by the National Guard, U.S. National Guard in 1989, 200th anniversary of the founding of the French National Guard and the French Revolution. And there's a poster which has a legend. And the legend tells the story of this militia unit, and also informs us that by the end of the 19th century, every state militia in the United States had renamed itself National Guard. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September of 1825, On September 7th, 1825, President John Quincy Adams sent Lafayette off aboard a new frigate named the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette's service in the Battle of the Brandywine, where he was wounded in the leg, thus shedding his blood for America's cause. While in his journal, Levasseur chronicles Lafayette's visits with his old friends John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, and his new friend Andrew Jackson, who he met in Washington in 1824. And through Levasseur's eyes, we get glimpses of the characters of these early American leaders. Jefferson is the ever-gracious host. Levasseur comments on the good appearance and cheerfulness of the Negroes of Monticello as attesting to the humanity of their master, but elsewhere describes slavery as a crime against humanity and advocates for the education of Blacks and gradual emancipation, reflecting Lafayette's well-known anti-slavery views. At Jackson's home in Tennessee, Lafayette is shown pistols that he, Lafayette, had given to Washington in 1778 and now belong to Jackson. When Lafayette recognizes them and comments that he felt true satisfaction in finding them in the hands of a man so worthy of such a legacy, Jackson blushes and, quote, his eye gleams as on a day of victory. The next story that I'm going to tell you takes place on August 6th, 1825. Lafayette comes down to breakfast and says to President Adams, I'd like to visit your predecessor, Mr. Monroe. Adams arranges an expedition. There were 2 or 3 carriages, about 10 people, including Lafayette's party and one of John Quincy Adams' sons. They get to the Potomac. The president pays the toll. They're crossing the bridge when they hear a noise behind them. It's the toll taker. Mr. President, you're 11 cents short. So the carriages stop, and there's this scene that occurs where they're counting people and carriages to see if the president had paid the right amount. And while this is going on, the toll taker sees Lafayette in one of the carriages and says, oh, I'm not going to take a toll for the nation's guest, as he was known. Well, President Adams said, no, I insist, let's keep counting. Sure enough, he was short the 11 cents. He paid it, and they went on. And Levasseur writes that it is ironic that the only time in this 13-month journey that a toll was paid on behalf of Lafayette was here in the presence of the head of state, a circumstance which in any other country would have surely conferred immunity on him. While in America, Lafayette was the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress and was addressed by Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who called him, and I quote, a faithful and fearless champion of liberty. Congress voted Lafayette a national reward of $200,000 and 23 acres of land in northern Florida, hence Lake Lafayette near Tallahassee. He was one of the earliest travelers on the Erie Canal. It wasn't quite open yet in 1825 as he returned from the West to Boston. Lafayette died on May 20, 1834, and was buried in Pequot Cemetery in Paris. President Jackson gave Lafayette the same military honors as John Adams had conferred on Washington's death. America mourned. There were eulogies in churches and state legislatures and in private societies. On December 31st, 1834, John Quincy Adams, now a congressman, gave the official eulogy of the United States. So what was the significance, and what is the significance of Lafayette's farewell tour? First, Lafayette's arrival in the United States in August of 1824 pacified the young country, which is in the midst of a vitriolic election campaign. Sound familiar? The 5 candidates in the race included Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. This was the first presidential election with not a single candidate being a member of the Revolutionary War generation. The November election result was so close that it ended up being decided in the House of Representatives in February of 1825. Lafayette's mere presence led to a temporary truce, if not a complete cessation of electoral hostilities. According to Lafayette's private secretary, Levasseur, for nearly 2 months, all hostilities as well as all the emotions excited by the election were forgotten, and one could only think anymore of Lafayette and the heroes of the Revolution. There were 2 reasons for this. One was the sense of patriotism that Lafayette's presence inspired in Americans. The other was that news of Lafayette crowded the rancorous political columns off the front pages of the nation's newspapers in many cases, and provided a steady dose of favorable, even joyful, alternative news. Second, Lafayette's 13-month visit restored a sense of pride and patriotism in a new generation on the cusp of the Jubilee year, 1826. The welcoming speeches across the country dwelled on the improvements in commerce, agriculture, population growth, the arts, and education. In his replies, Lafayette spoke admiringly of the progress he observed throughout the nation since he had last visited. Americans attributed these successes to the Republic, which Lafayette had had a major role in founding. One New Hampshire Freemason went so far as to exclaim, quote, "Whatever is lovely or exalted in the social and political conditions of America, we contemplate with enthusiasm as a monument of your virtues." The repetition of these themes all over the country, which were reported widely in the public press, engendered a strong current of renewed patriotism throughout the land. As Lucy Penn Howell of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, wrote after meeting Lafayette at a ball in her hometown, "Meeting Lafayette was one of the happiest moments of my life. Being able to thank him personally for his service to America," she wrote, "made one feel 10 times more of an American than I did before." Third, as we addressed earlier in the speech, the farewell tour set off a naming frenzy, as well as the erection of over 20 Lafayette statues and monuments. In addition to the 80 cities, counties, and towns, the streets, there are numerous schools named for Lafayette, and there are about 75 Masonic lodges called Lafayette Lodge. Finally, Lafayette's tour solidified his role as the go-to symbol of Franco-American friendship. Did you know that the inspirational spark for the Statue of Liberty was lit in the 1860s when Edouard Laboulaye, the principal promoter of the enterprise, and Frédéric Bartholdi, its sculptor, discussed how the Americans honored Lafayette and the French volunteers as much as they honored their own patriots? Did you know that the principal address at the 1886 inauguration of the statue, given by Peekskill, New York orator and later U.S. Senator Chauncey Depew, was essentially a biography of Lafayette? Mr. Depew began his oration this way, quote, "The story of Lafayette's life is the history of the time which made possible this statue, and his spirit is the very soul of this celebration." He continued, "The alliance with France during the American Revolution assured our triumph, and Lafayette assured the alliance." Even in modern times, during every state visit of a French president, Lafayette and his role in the American Revolution are referenced from many times in speeches and toasts. One member of the American Friends of Lafayette calculated that when President Macron visited in 2018, Lafayette was mentioned a total of 21 times in the various speeches and toasts. I will end this talk with an obituary, not of Lafayette, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. Mr. Kramer died in Philadelphia during the blizzard of 1888. He didn't die as a result of the blizzard, but he happened to die while it was ongoing. The headline in all caps of this obituary reads, "A man who knew Lafayette dead." And then it continues. David Kramer died on Monday evening, the 12th, after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. Keep that in mind. He was 73 in 1888. He many years ago resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy dwellings for the leading men of the city. He was a member of the F&AM, the Masons, Carpenters Association, a high-end guild. Carpenter Hall is a famous building in Philadelphia, and the IO of OF, the Odd Fellows. And at one time was an active member of the city council. And then the buried lead. In his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you do the math, David Kramer, a successful builder and city councilor and joiner, was 9 years old when, along with 5,000 other school children, the newspaper reports 70 schools sent 70 pupils to see Lafayette. He met Lafayette with these other 5,000 students outside Independence Hall on October 4, 1824, and that was, according to his obituary, the most important event of his life. That gives you an idea of how the American people felt about Lafayette in the 19th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that wonderful telling of Lafayette's tour. Before we get to the question and answer session, I'm going to let Peter Riley talk about what's going on this year.
Well, there are 50, the American Friends of Lafayette has 50 committees for the District of Columbia, and there were 24 states at the time. There's 25 now, thanks to West Virginia, where he also stopped. If you go to Lafayette200.org, you'll find an events list, which is growing. As Alan related, he came to Massachusetts relatively early, and I could talk about that in detail. We have 30 events, but one of the interesting things I've learned in working on this is that the tour is a great national event, and there are accounts, and there are many accounts of it, and it's mentioned often in national history. However, it is also kind of buried in local history, and you'll find that towns where Lafayette stopped, in many cases, that's the most significant thing that happened in that town. And it's really amazing. I found a couple of towns in Massachusetts where there was a pageant in 1912 or 1913 about the great things that happened in the town, and Lafayette's stop is a big part of that. At any rate, I'm sorry. Mayor Quincy wrote to Lafayette when it was known that he was going to visit, and asked him to come to Boston. And Lafayette wrote back and said, well, I don't know where I'm going to land, but wherever I do, I will head to Boston quite quickly. And he did, in fact, keep that promise. He landed in New York in August. Alan related all that. But in New York, the events, the landing on Staten Island, and the tremendous event that is all being recreated in 2024 on the exact date and more or less in the exact place where it took place. And it goes from there. In Massachusetts, I'll say in Rhode Island, he's only in Rhode Island for a day. There'll be an event during the day at Roger Williams Park on August 23rd, and then there's a ticketed ball that night in Providence. In Massachusetts, it'll start in Dedham. And they're going to, in front of the Unitarian Church, they're going to be reenacting a play, doing a play based on a short story that someone wrote in 1909. And from there, he stayed with Governor Eustis at the Shirley Eustis House. There'll be an event at the Shirley Eustis House that night, recreating the recreating Lafayette's arrival there, and there'll be a breakfast there in the morning. Big thing in Boston, there'll be a parade on the 24th. The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company has been managing that. We then compress three of the events into the next day. His visits to Medford, Quincy, where he met with John Quincy Adams, and Charlestown, where he was invited to come back the next year for Bunker Hill. I'm not going to name. The following weekend, which ends up being Labor Day weekend, early on August 30th and 31st. We split up one day. Lafayette visited 7 towns, and we split it into 2 days. Then he's in New Hampshire at Portsmouth. And Alan, can you name the several towns in New Hampshire? Right, they stops on the way up.
Yeah, there will be events in Hampton Falls, Hampton, Greenland, and then Portsmouth in the afternoon. There'll be a banquet in Portsmouth in the evening.
Right. Okay, and then Lafayette went back to Boston. He rode all night in his carriage to get back to Boston, so he could start heading west. Then he, in the accounts, he stopped at this place called West Concord, which was renamed Arlington in 1867. We managed to figure that out, and then there'll be a casual event there where people will be able to just come into their museum and meet Lafayette. Lexington and Concord have tremendous events. Lexington is going to do a real reenactment of what happened, where he met with like 5, 6, 7, 8 of the veterans of the battle on April 19th, 1775. In Concord, they're also doing a little reenactment, but also it's going to be kind of a seminar on Robert Gross, who wrote the Minutemen in Their World and the Transcendentalists in Their World will be speaking. And I'm really pleased about Worcester County. Old Sturbridge Village has really pitched in to help with it. And again, it's mainly the local historical societies, the DAR, and a couple of churches. In Worcester County, we're going to have 9 events, and there are 6 places in Worcester County. Bolton is the night before where he stayed, the house that he stayed in. There are 6 buildings that Lafayette would have either went into or at least seen and stopped in front of that are still extant. I don't know if anybody else tops that, and we'll have events at all of them. I should be able to tell you more about the rest of the country, but I've been buried in Massachusetts for a while. So, but each of the 50 states, I'm sorry, each of the 25 states involved Some of them he was only there a brief time, but everyone will have at least some event there. And Lafayette200.org will give you information on that. Of course, some of the events are still being planned, for the ones in 2025 in particular. I don't know if I have anything else, Alan. Did I cover as much as I should? Or
Yes, I just wanted to add that he's back in Massachusetts in a fairly
yes.
major way in
Oh yeah,
2025. So we're going to be doing stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
as a matter of fact, the Bunker Hill people are already working on that event. That's going to be a huge event because it's really it's an America 250 event because the 200th anniversary of Lafayette being there to lay the cornerstone is the 250th anniversary of the battle. So that's going to be really interesting. The town of Worthington where he stayed the night on his way to Boston from Albany, has had us out there with the panels a couple of weeks ago for their Founders Day. So they're already pretty far along in planning their event. So it's really very exciting, and really want to thank Old Sturbridge Village will be sending their people out from Worcester. They'll be in Worcester, Leicester, Charlton, and then on the Common in Sturbridge, and we're really excited about that. So
Awesome. Thank you both. We're really excited about it too. So we do have a few questions if you guys are willing to answer some.
Sure.
Let's start with the first one. Was the Chateau de Grange owned by I'm going to say this very incorrectly and I apologize, Noailles? Noailles.
Yes. Is that the entire question?
Yes.
Yeah. So the Chateau, well, they call it in France Lagrange, but all the cities named for Lagrange are called Lagrange in the US. But the Chateau Lagrange came down in Lafayette's wife's family, the Noailles, Noailles. So it was really her family chateau. He, of course, inherited it when she died in the first decade of the 19th century, and it was a farm. It's a big farm. It's an old chateau with towers and the like. Well, we showed one slide of it, but yes, it became very well known to America that that's where Lafayette lived. There are several stories where they show illuminations of the chateau at balls for Lafayette. This happened at a big ball at Castle Garden in September, and he is described as being very moved by seeing his chateau. And he says, "Ma maison," in a tone of voice, something like that, my home.
Awesome. I think we actually have a couple of those plates that you showed in our collection as well.
Oh, yeah.
With the Grange on it. Another question we have is, can you comment on those who traveled with Lafayette, especially the Scottish feminist Fanny Wright?
Well, of course, his secretary and his son were there for the whole trip. Frances Wright joined his party for a period of time, and there are reports of her being in various places, including at Monticello, when Lafayette was at Monticello, which must have been fascinating because she was a pepper pot and a true radical in many respects. So she was probably the most interesting person who traveled with Lafayette. There's another man who joined the party for a period of time, a Frenchman. We don't know too much about him, de Sillon, but he shows up when he's out in the Midwest and as he's coming back from the West in Pennsylvania. But Frances Wright, or Fanny Wright, she was a Scotswoman. She was an author. She was already a published author. She wrote a book about America, and she had this plan and she implemented it, of setting up a community to prove that blacks and whites could get along together. It was like a demonstration community. It didn't work out the way she had hoped, but she later went back to Europe and married, etc.
She sounds like a very interesting woman.
Yes.
So another a question we have is, could you briefly touch on the relationship between the Monroes and the Lafayette families?
Yes, Lafayette and James Monroe were, of course, veterans of the American Revolution. They were together at least at the Battle of Brandywine and at Valley Forge. Some people think that James Monroe actually was one of those who helped carry him off the field when he was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. I don't think that's correct, but their relationship was solidified in the 1790s forever, because at that time Lafayette was in prison in actually was in Olmütz, which is now Olomouc, Czech Republic, but it was part of Austria at the time. And the revolution had cascaded into the terror. And Lafayette's wife was in prison in Paris, and probably would have been beheaded like her mother, sister, older sister, and grandmother were, but for the fact that Robespierre fell in July of 1794. But she couldn't get out of prison. And when James Monroe arrived as the ambassador, he and his wife made a big point of visiting her and lobbying for her to get out of prison. She did get out of prison. They helped her. One of the Lafayette family names was Motier, and they helped her get a passport in the name of Mrs. Motier. And she left the country. She sent her son to George Washington. He spent a year at Mount Vernon. She had done that, but she left the country with her two daughters, and they actually went to visit Lafayette in prison. But the emperor said, who hated Lafayette, blamed him for the death of his niece Marie Antoinette and for the French Revolution. Said, if you can visit him, but if you go in, you can't come out. So she and her two daughters joined him in prison for over a year before they were finally released when Napoleon overran Europe.
Wow, he lived a very interesting life.
He did.
I have another question here. What reflections did Lafayette have during the Foul World Tour about our war for independence?
About I'm sorry.
About our war for independence.
I'd like to tackle that a little if I could.
Sure.
But one of the things that was interesting about the tour, and why I hesitate a little for the rock star metaphor, is that Lafayette didn't come to town and put on a show. The town put on a show for Lafayette. So you'll read the speeches, and they'll talk about how Lafayette was so important in us achieving our revolution. And then usually Lafayette will then have some sort of modest reply, and he might sometimes point to the veterans, or no, you guys, or you guys really did this yourselves. I tend to think of him being treated more as a superhero than as a rock star, but it's the speeches will say Lafayette second only to Washington, and usually his reply is short and modest. So I don't know, Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, well, basically the Americans who greeted Lafayette felt that, or at least in their speeches, they said that they attributed these successes of the American experiment to the revolution, because the revolution ushered in the Republic, and the Republic had brought all these improvements, population, farming, commerce, education, the arts, etc. So it was like both sides. Lafayette and the American people who greeted him were very praising of the American Revolution and its fruits because of its fruits.
Awesome. Thank you both. So we've had kind of two similar questions, so I'll kind of lump them together. Where on the tour did Lafayette see James Armistead? And kind of tied with that, were they ever able to meet again?
Well, it's interesting. I have concluded, and I now have support for this from the person who knows more about Lafayette than anyone in the world. His name is Professor Robert Kraut, that Lafayette actually embraced James Armistead in 1824 at Yorktown on October 18th. Many people say that this occurred in Richmond, and the reason for that is the newspaper account was in a Richmond newspaper, but it was like 2 or 3 weeks after Lafayette was in Richmond, and it was from a correspondent. And if you actually read and analyze the story, which ends with Lafayette seeing James Armistead in the crowd and embracing him, you can tell that it had to be Yorktown and not Richmond. So I say it was Yorktown. Did they meet again during the tour? Likely not, because Lafayette, after 1824, did not go to Yorktown again, or to where James lived, which was a little north, I believe, of Yorktown.
Yeah, but Alan, he must have seen him. He came back to the United States not long after the Revolution for a period, right? And I think he saw him then, and he was upset that he hadn't been liberated. And
well, that was the time that James, he must have seen him then, because James asked Lafayette to write a testimonial for him. He had been applying for his freedom because of his services as a spy to the American cause during the Revolution. And Lafayette composed in November of 1784 while he was in Richmond, I think at the time, because he gave it to the legislature, composed a testimonial about the services James has performed, and whatever you could do for this man would be great. Da, 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 da. And he was liberated a couple of years later after that by Virginia.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have a couple questions about the bicentennial celebrations. Some people are wondering if there's anything going on outside of the East Coast, so California and Kentucky specifically were mentioned.
There's got to be a committee for. Well, okay, was Kentucky a state in 1824? I think it was.
Yes, it
right?
was.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Okay. So there's got to be a committee for Kentucky.
There are several. There are several. There's a Louisville committee. I'm sure there's a Lexington committee. Lafayette spent a few days in Kentucky and he visited Frankfurt. There's likely a Frankfurt committee. So yes, there will be events in Kentucky. We have no events planned in California, even though there's a Lafayette, California, named for him.
But I wouldn't rule them out, because there's a period where Lafayette is kind of not traveling from roughly November to February. He's in Virginia. He's doing a lot of interesting things, but he's not traveling a lot. So I think anybody who steps up and wants to have an event in December in California or Arizona or whatnot might find some support. But I think it's got to come from there, because
we're overwhelmed with what we've got on.
I believe it. You guys are doing a lot. Tied to the previous question we just had, someone is asking what the name of the professor you referenced when you were answering that question was, what his name was.
Robert, R-O-B-E-R-T, Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S, Kraut, C-R-O-U-T. And he's with the, what is it called? The College of Charleston in South Carolina.
So we have another question referencing the bicentennial. It's again with California. They're wondering how they can help with a celebration in Fresno, California, if that's possible.
Uh, can I tell you what we try to do in the places that we're committed to? We try to provide the Lafayette in the first, at a minimum, but sometimes at a maximum, to provide the Lafayette interpreter. And that's what we're doing. So in all these events that Peter talked about in Massachusetts, there will be a Lafayette interpreter in uniform costume, 1824 garb. So we can't commit to places like Fresno, California. We don't have the resources and we don't have the bandwidth. We can be consultants, perhaps, and help you out. I got a communication from someone out west. I think it was California. Maybe it's one of the people on this call. And they wanted a speaker. And I gave them a couple of people who live out, in the West. I don't know whether anything happened beyond that. So we can be a resource, but we can't get too involved in the planning or execution of an event.
Yeah. And actually, the event, all the events in Massachusetts, most of the work is, the work is being done by the local people. So Fresno could have its vision of what Lafayette means, and it might be quite interesting because you're not bound by any, he wasn't ever there. So I mean, maybe you can get the guy who played him in Hamilton to come out.
That would be good. I'd actually go to that one.
Thank you both. Another question related to the bicentennial. Are there any events along the Ohio River when he travels up the river to Kentucky and passes Indiana?
Yes. For example, I'm trying to think of the town right across from Louisville, Jeffersonville, or is it Jeffersonville? There were events in Jeffersonville, which is a very nice place. I went out there, and I actually gave talks in Jeffersonville and in Louisville on consecutive days, and we have great committees out there. They're very much involved. So yes, there are events on the Ohio River.
Alan, is that where the boat sank?
Well, the Ohio River, not terribly far from there. Yeah.
Yeah, because Chuck wants to recreate that,
I know. I don't know how serious he is.
Chuck Schwam, the chief operating officer, is really doing a lot of the work on this. Lafayette's boat sank, and he wants to recreate that. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But he didn't spend a lot of time in Indiana. He just went over the border, spent a day or an evening, and then came back to Louisville, I believe. Yeah.
Awesome.
Other than when they were shipwrecked, he was.
Okay, I think we have a time for a couple more questions. I do appreciate all these wonderful questions. This is great. A question is, I note that the French Navy squadron anchored in Hampton Roads, Virginia in October 1824, essentially boycotting Lafayette's tour. Can you provide insight on the relationship between Lafayette and the Bourbons?
Well, they were his high school buds, kind of. He's very, very close to Louis the 16th, Louis the 18th, Charles the 10th, right? Is that? Yep. It's the three of them, and they knew one another when Lafayette was coming up. But he believed that a republic is the ideal form of government, but that it wouldn't work for France. So France should have a constitutional monarchy, which led him to be disliked by both sides. Lafayette's tremendously popular in America, as close to universal as you can get, and not so much in France. um, because they believed in they wanted to return to they were working on returning to absolute monarchy. Metternich, who was the great thinker that was going to make the world safe for absolute monarchy, in his diary wrote, "Lafayette is dead, not soon enough." When he got word that Lafayette died, so they didn't like him at all. I guess it's Alan. Maybe I'm
No, at that point in time, you have what are sometimes referred to the ultra royalists, and this was the 1820s with Louis the 18th, who died in 1824, and then it got even worse with Charles the 10th. But they blamed Lafayette for the French Revolution, and their brother was killed, their sister-in-law was killed, so they were not fond of Lafayette to begin with, and they were concerned about the farewell tour because Lafayette's purpose, one of the purposes, was to prove, to show the success of the American experiment to Europe, which would help his cause in France and also to advance republicanism in Europe. And they didn't like that. So they were very negative. They censored the newspapers. When Levasseur was sending back dispatches, and the newspapers would come out with holes in them. So Lafayette and Levasseur got these two writers to write a book, which Peter actually uncovered online, and we just translated it. We had it translated. It's going to be published in time, at least electronically, for the bicentennial kickoff on August 15th. But the way they got around the censorship, now I don't know if anyone bought this book, by the way, but the way they got around the censorship was to put it in a book, because that they didn't censor as much. They were worried about the periodic newspapers and the periodic press.
Yeah. Actually, there's a novel that just came out recently called The Lafayette Circle, and it's about the Holy Alliance sending hit squads out to assassinate Lafayette, and the group of Americans who secretly worked to protect him, and then how it was all hushed up. But I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is there's another French Revolution. It's 1830, right, Alan? The
Revolution of 1830. Yeah,
1830, which I always thought that musical Les Mis was about 1848. That was what it was in my head. It was actually about 1830, and at the end, Lafayette ends up playing a role in that and kind of blessing Louis Philippe, who is going to be a constitutional monarch, he thinks anyway, so you know, the Bourbons didn't like Lafayette. I suspect they still don't.
I think that's true. But there's one anecdote about Charles the 10th, who was actually about Lafayette's age, exactly. But he is quoted as having said there were only, towards the end of his reign, he got kicked out. He's the one that the Revolution of 1830 bounced. He said there are only two men in France who have stayed consistent to their principles, Lafayette and I. So I imagine there was some sort of respect there, even though there was hostility.
Fascinating. So I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to call it a night. So one individual is asking about a presentation they saw at the Continental Conference for the Daughters of the American Republic, where there was an actor portraying Colonel Lafayette. Do you know anything about this?
No.
Colonial Lafayette.
What was that?
It's Colonial Lafayette, not Colonel.
Okay, okay. I see.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, his father was a colonel, I think.
Right.
Okay.
No, just don't know.
That's fine. Because you guys do have an actor portraying Lafayette for the bicentennial, yeah.
Yes,
Massachusetts, we have 3.
Wow. That's awesome.
I
we're
mean,
hoping
they
people
have,
won't, we're hoping people won't notice that they're different.
yeah, I mean, some of them have day jobs and, lives, so.
Understandable.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us and thank you for sharing all this information with us. If you did not catch the entire program or you would like to share a recording of the webinar, it will be sent to our members in the following week and it will also be uploaded on our Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page. So thank you again to both of our presenters, Alan and Peter, and for all of you for joining us tonight. I hope you guys have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.